I'd like to begin this morning with a quote from the Colombian novelist Gabriel Marquez, who in his book Love in the Time of Cholera said, "Human beings are not born once and for all on the day their mothers give birth to them, but life obliges them over and over again to give birth to themselves." I like this idea much better than this myth that many of us seem to live in, that you're born, you live a while, and then it's over. I like this idea that we're not products as human beings, that we're not fixed, that we're not static, but that we're always evolving, always becoming, always being born again and again. A parent realizes this when they have a child, that a baby hasn't just been born, but a mother or father has been born also. A prince or a princess realizes when the king or queen dies that a new king is born or a new queen is born. Throughout our lives and all the different rites of passage and transitions that we go through, we are constantly changing and transforming. There are times in our lives where we kill the follower and become a leader, where we turn away from playing the victim to embody being the hero. And I'd say for me, and probably for many of you too, the folks who we admire most in this world are those who allow something of the sacred to be born in themselves, to such a degree that they become not only blessed by that sacred being born, but a blessing to those around them. And so, in beginning the message today, I invite us to ask ourselves that question of what is being called to be born as you? What am I being called to give birth to in my own life? And then for me, and it usually is the answer, it's a kind of love. I want to give birth to a greater love, a greater way of being in love, where I can be more present to the joys of my life and more capable of responding to the challenges that come up in life. How about for you? What do you want to see born in your life? What's being birthed through you? Anybody? Is it still too early? Too much chocolate?
Feed his sheep.
Hey, all right. Thank you, team. Mark?
Fearlessness.
Fearlessness, all right. Anybody else? Yeah, JR.
The highest version of myself.
The highest version of yourself. Good. I like that, where we were able to understand that in church in one particular way, where if you said it somewhere else, it may come on.
Best version.
Yes, the best version of ourselves. And that's all the best of us can ever, I think, hope for. And to me, it's at the heart of the Easter story as well. That I think that, although I respect the view that the resurrection story is about Jesus having one last miracle for everyone to be in awe over him about, I think that the story is really about being born in a greater way, being willing to let go of what no longer serves us so that we can be indeed resurrected with a greater aspect of ourselves. That to me is so much about what the Easter story is about, and it's also so much about how we bring the seeming opposites of life together in order to create something sacred and whole. In the case of Jesus, it was this aspect of bringing the human and the spiritual together. These two seeming opposite things, but in the story of Jesus, we have the story of Jesus becoming fully human so that he could truly realize the spirit, and becoming truly spiritual so that he could realize the human. As I mentioned earlier, we're using the sermons of Martin Luther King Jr. to inspire the talks this month, and he said something quite profound to me. He said, "Life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony." One more time. Life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites in fruitful harmony. I'd say the biggest complaint or question I get asked as a minister of folks who want to live a spiritual life is I can't do it because my human life is going on. I like to meditate, but it's not easy when there's 3 kids running a circle around me. Or I like to pray and I feel good, but then I turn on Fox News and everything goes to hell. And so it's this idea that in order to build a spiritual life, we have to do it as distinct from the human life. But to me, this is a mistake. The true spirituality comes when we bring those things together. It's when you have one kid hanging on your neck and another one hanging around your ankle, and you can take a deep breath and say, "Thank you, life." That to me, you're really living a spiritual life. It's when you can say a prayer and feel good and then turn on Fox News and say, "God bless you, Donald Trump," or "God bless you, Hillary Clinton," or even bless you, Sean Hannity, or whatever it may be. But it's this idea when we really integrate our human lives and our spiritual life that we're really making something powerful happen in what we do. Jesus said, "Enter in through the narrow door, for wide is the door and broad is the road which leads to destruction, and many are those who travel on it. Oh, how narrow is the door, and how difficult is the road which leads to life, and few are those who are found on it." So many of us, unfortunately, find ourselves living lives by trying to make extremes of the opposite, trying to push them further apart, as opposed to bringing them together. And humanity is great, but it isn't so great when it rejects the sacred or the spiritual. And the spiritual is really great, but only to the extent that it includes and can be embodied in our humanity. I love something that King said, addressing the symbol of the cross. He said, "It would be wonderful were I to look at the cross and sense only such a sublime reaction. But somehow I could never turn my eyes from that cross without also realizing that it symbolizes a strange mixture of greatness and smallness, of good and evil. As I behold that uplifted cross, I am reminded not only of the unlimited power of God, but also of the sordid weakness of man. I think not only of the radiance of the divine, but also the tang of the human. I am reminded not only of Christ at his best, but of man at his worst. We must see the cross as the magnificent symbol of love, conquering hate, and of light, overcoming darkness. But in the midst of this glowing affirmation, let us never forget that our Lord and Master was nailed to that cross because of human blindness. Those who crucified him knew not what they did." And that's the tendency sometimes in our humanness, to forget what is sacred, to forget what is valuable, and to move to that extreme that would have us be so soft-minded that we might look badly on someone who is embracing or embodying the sacred. We certainly live in a world today, right now, even this morning, where we're able to come together in a spirit of love and unity when we know there are areas in the world where human lack of possibility seems to be demonstrating itself. So when we verge too far to the human, we begin to err. We can easily begin to make mistakes. Yet also at the same time, when we verge too much to the spiritual, we can kind of lose touch of what matters as well. It's when we're only caught up in the spiritual that we often get doctrinal, when we start to get exclusivist, when we start to put down certain people for being the way they are, as opposed to being inclusive in love. There's an old legend about Jesus that goes back to the medieval times that says that the first thing Jesus did when he became resurrected is he went down to hell and he set all the sinners free. And the devil was so upset that he began to weep and sit down. And Jesus went and approached Satan and he said, "What's the matter?" And Satan was crying. He says, "Well, you've set everyone free. I'm going to be alone down here forever." Jesus says, "Don't worry. From now on, I'm going to send you all of the self-righteous." And I like this point of view because that can be the problem sometimes when we get so caught up in the spiritual and the way we think things ought to be and everyone should accord to our beliefs of the way things that should be. We start to practice exclusivism. We start to push people down in order to pull our self-righteousness up. I believe that the sacred and the spiritual is very important. It represents capital T truth. It represents wholeness. It represents wisdom. But it's not until it's fully actualized in the human that we can have a quality like reverence or awe. It's not until the spirit becomes human that we can have that feeling of authenticity, of sincerity. It's not until the spirit is actualized in our humanity that we have humility. And I would argue it's not really until we've downloaded that sense of spirituality in our humanity that we can give birth to that consciousness of love. Not just a soft, foo-foo kind of love, but that love that is the most creative, transformative, and powerful force that there is in the world. We each have the key to it when we bring together the sacred and the human in ourselves. We bring it forth in all that we do. Martin Luther King was obviously a student of Jesus' teaching, and one of the teachings that King liked the most was in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus tells his disciple that they must be like sheep among wolves, that they should be as wise as serpents, yet as harmless as doves. Isn't that interesting? First of all, this idea that the serpent at the time represented wisdom as opposed to something evil like we've learned later. But this idea is as harmless as a dove. Can you imagine a football coach? Boys, I want you to go out there and be as harmless as doves. Or got them. But what does that mean? Be as wise as a serpent and as harmless as a dove. And King had a way of describing that in human terms. He said that the way to bring together the human and the spiritual in our lives, the way I would argue to be a Christian in the sense of practicing the teachings of Jesus, is to have a tough mind and a tender heart. The wisdom of the serpent and the harmlessness of the dove. Have a tough mind and a tender heart. King would argue that so much in his time, I'm sure looking at our times today, he'd say the same thing, that we lack tough-mindedness, that we don't often take the time to think critically, much less for ourselves. We are so apt to let somebody else or the consciousness of the world around us do our thinking for us, that we don't truly develop sometimes the responsibility of being an individual. King would say, few people realize that even our authentic channels of information, the press, the platform, and in many instances the pulpit, do not give us objective and unbiased truth. Few people have the toughness of mind to judge critically and to discern the true from the false, the fact from the fiction. Our minds are constantly being invaded by legions of half-truths, prejudices, and false facts. One of the great needs of mankind is to be lifted above the morass of false propaganda. And King shared that the opposite of tough-mindedness is soft-mindedness. And we fall into that when we're unwilling to think critically, when we're unwilling to make up our own mind about things. He talks about the simple ways of doing this as opposed to falling head over heels into a marketing ideology, to something as grand as the injustice and prejudice and racism that was going on at the time of King's teaching as well. He shares humorously, I got a letter the other day, and it was a new magazine coming out. And it opened up, Dear Dr. King, as you know, you are on many mailing lists, and you are categorized as highly intelligent, progressive, a lover of the arts and sciences, and I know you will want to read what I have to say. King goes on, of course I did. After you said all of that and explained me so exactly, of course I wanted to read it. But you know how we, even as a people, we have that tendency to want to follow the loudest voice as opposed to the wisest voice? That even in our own consciousness, we're so apt to follow the first fear instead of the great love? That we are so quick to give into a judgment almost because it's easier than to live strong in a value and an intention? That's the important role of tough-mindedness that King is speaking to, and that Jesus talked about to us about as well, in this idea of being wise as serpents. King says that being tough-minded isn't enough, however. In truth, if we're too tough-minded without anything else, we grow hard-hearted. We also need a tender heart. We're called to be compassionate, to practice our values of love, of givingness, of harmony. And unless we bring these two things together, both kind of fall apart on their own. The opposite of tender-heartedness for King is hard-heartedness. He shares The hard-hearted person never truly loves. He engages in a crass utilitarianism that values other people, mainly according to their usefulness to him. He never experiences the beauty of friendship because he is too cold to feel affection for another and is too self-centered to share another's joy and sorrow. He is an isolated island. No outpouring of love links him with the mainland of humanity. And before we in our minds put that hard-heartedness on the character of some villain, I think it's important to remember, at least in my life, I can fall into being hard-hearted at any given moment. Before I know it, I can catch myself utilizing other people in order to validate or invalidate how I feel or to get what I want. I'm so apt at times to give in to being irritable or judgmental as opposed to knowing a higher and greater truth. It's so easy to become hard-hearted. And when I really investigate it and think about it, what's going on is I'm afraid in that moment of the tender heart. I'm afraid to be vulnerable to it because when I'm vulnerable, that means that I might have to change. It means that I might have to give birth to something new. And as much as many of us don't want to admit it, sometimes that pain or that fear or that judgment is like a warm blanket, isn't it? It's something that we've taught ourselves to keep ourselves safe in. But welcoming in that tender heart again means no longer being afraid of love. Now, just the tender heart isn't enough because we have to have that tough mind, right? Because vulnerability requires trust. Intimacy requires trust. Some of the great blessings of my life has been when I've only had a tough mind, but a tender heart has come in to save me from somewhere else. Or when I've only had a tender heart and have been being taken advantage of or something like that, and a tough mind has come in to shake me to my senses. I remember being about 14 years old, and I would walk home from school, and there were these 3 kids that would bully me every day. And the ringleader was particularly tough. He was like 15, but he was like, almost 6 feet tall. And I remember his head just looked just like Spicoli from Fast Times at Ridgemont High. It was Sean Penn's character. And his body looked like Jean-Claude Van Damme. So if you remember him, because he was still kind of short, but really, really buff. And they would push me and they'd call me names. And one time I went into 7-Eleven because that was my spiritual ritual at the time, was to get a Slurpee from 7-Eleven. I went to the back and I filled it up, and they were waiting for me in line. And they were pushing me and they were calling me names. And I didn't know what to do, but at that moment I was able to call forth that tough-mindedness. I remember it really well, and I remember taking my Slurpee, and it just went in slow motion. It just went over the guy's head and slowly started pouring down his head. He just happened to be wearing a white t-shirt that day, and so I could see the white coconut and the orange and the Coca-Cola flavor and the purple flavor of all the Slurpee start slowly just covering him, and just started covering the floor around him. And I remember being in a state of elation that this was taking place. I was so happy about it. But what my tough-mindedness had not allowed me to do was to think about what was going to happen to me next. So I knew I was going to be in big trouble. And seemingly out of nowhere, a voice came out and said, "Stop!" And there was an older woman behind the counter there. And she pointed her finger so strong to the boy, and she said, "You stay." And she pointed at me and she said, "You go." And all I remember is I listened to her. And I got home very quickly. And the funny thing is I don't recall ever seeing that young man again. I'm not saying that she did anything to him, because I'm not sure what happened. But I know it's in a sense a silly example, but don't we all have those moments where we are in a tough-mindedness and God blesses us with a tender heart to open us up to receive some compassion? And aren't there are those times where we find ourselves only in tender-heartedness and afraid of having a tough mind, and there is someone to remind us of the truth of who we are, to remind us to have strong guidelines and boundaries for how we live our lives and allow others to be blessed by us, because it can be so easy to be taken advantage of. And that is, again, why we have that wisdom of the serpent and that harmlessness of the dove. When we really bring these two together, the tough-mindedness and the tender-heartedness, we're really practicing King would teach, and I would say too, what it means to be a Christian in the world, a follower of what Jesus taught. It means to have that balance, because when those two things come together, that humanness and that spirituality, we really give birth to love in a greater way in our lives. Again, as I was saying earlier, we have so many people in this world who have fooled themselves into thinking that the tactic of murdering people in mass amounts will get their cause realized. I don't remember any time where this has really happened in some profound way. And King, in his day, was often challenged. So was Gandhi as well, for practicing that technique of nonviolence, which they both called a kind of love force, a soul force. Look up to your enemy. Don't have any illusions about him. But stand up for yourself. Stand up for your dignity and stand in love. And you can not only change your own life, but help change the minds of people around you. We can all do a better job of this in our own lives. King would say of the toughness of love. He'd say, I have decided to stick to love, for I know that love is ultimately the only answer to mankind's problems, and I'm going to talk about it everywhere I go. I know it isn't popular to talk about it in some circles today. I'm not talking about emotional bosh when I talk about love. I'm talking about a strong, demanding love, and I have seen too much hate. And I say to myself that hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to love. That's how we give birth to love in our lives. We let go of the burden of hate. We let go of the burden of judgment. Certainly we are all born in love, but how quickly it can die within us when we feel broken by abuse, or by an unkind word, or by a mistake by our own person, whatever it may be. It's up to us to give love a chance to be born in our lives again, not in just the way of sweetness, but in the way of strength and transformative power. This is something that Gandhi did in his practice as well, and I bring up Gandhi to say that he was perhaps one of the best Christians who would not be classified traditionally as Christian in the Christian sense. He was someone who was actually incensed with the church as it showed up in colonial Britain, but he learned to read about their teacher, Jesus. And when he studied him, Jesus became his teacher in his fight for freedom for Indian people everywhere. Gandhi would say, Christ came into this world to preach and spread the gospel of love and peace. But what his followers have brought about is tyranny and misery. Christians who were taught the maxim of love thy neighbor as thyself are divided among themselves. But he would go on to say, Jesus expressed as no other could the spirit and will of God. It is in this sense that I see him and recognize him as the Son of God. And because the life of Jesus has the significance and the transcendency to which I have alluded, I believe that he belongs not solely to Christianity, but to the entire world, to all races and all people. And so as a closing thought today, I'm going to invite Jennifer to come up here too, because she's going to pray us out with a song. Is for all of us to remember that the greatest spiritual illusion we can fall under is that something separates us from the love of God. Remember that nothing separates you from the love of life, the love of spirit, and the presence of the sacred. No teacher, especially someone as grand as Jesus, no particular teaching, no particular fault or sin, that the only thing that separates you from the love of God is your own inability to say yes to it. So let us remember what it means to be a good Christian, a good Buddhist, a good Muslim, a good human being, is to find and give room for the sacred to be born in us so that we can know it ourselves and share it with others.
Let's close our eyes together. And let this be a prayer right to your heart. I am worthy of my own love. I am worthy of my own love. I'm not too little or too much. I'm enough just as I am, and I am worthy of my own love. I am worthy of my own love. I am worthy of my own love. I accept who I am, and I stand up and speak my truth. I stand up and speak my truth. I stand up and speak my truth. I am strong and I express myself, and I am worthy of my own love.